The Ghost Child. A mother's grief unleashed. In the chilling story The Ghost Child, an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, long for a child after years of trying. Finally, they find a baby mysteriously left near an abandoned graveyard. Overjoyed, they adopt him and name him John. However, strange things start to happen. John exhibits eerie abilities, like communicating with spirits and predicting deaths, leading the Thompsons to consult with multiple spiritual leaders. They are told John is not an ordinary child and that he has a deep connection to the supernatural. Despite warnings, they raise him lovingly, though they can't shake the disturbing sense that John's fate is intertwined with a dark past. The story spirals into a terrifying encounter with vengeful spirits, ancient curses, and a deadly plot by a powerful villain. In a climactic twist, it is revealed that John may be the reincarnation of a tragic figure, caught between the world of the living and the dead, as he tries to break free from the evil forces that seek to claim him. Part 1. The Mysterious Baby. It was a night unlike any other. The air was thick with a chilling mist that clung to the skin like icy fingers, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long twisted shadows over the path that led to the old graveyard. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson walked side by side, their steps slow and heavy as they made their way through the fog-draped woods. It had been years since they had ventured this far from their home, but something had drawn them out this evening. Something neither of them could explain, a pull that gnawed at their souls and refused to let go. The couple had long resigned themselves to a quiet, childless life. After years of trying, of hoping, of praying, the realization had sunk in there would be no children for them. The house they had dreamed of filling with laughter remained silent, each passing year weighing heavier on their hearts. And now here they were, walking through the woods in the dead of night, their breaths visible in the frigid air, neither speaking a word. It was as if the trees themselves were watching, their gnarled branches twisting overhead like skeletal hands reaching out to the sky. Suddenly, a sound cut through the stillness, a cry, faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. A baby's cry. Mrs. Thompson stopped dead in her tracks, her hand gripping her husband's arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, eyes wide with disbelief. They stood there, frozen, straining to hear it again. The wind rustled the leaves, sending a cascade of dead foliage across the path. Then once more, the cry pierced the air, louder this time, more urgent. Without a word, they began to move, their feet crunching against the brittle leaves as they followed the sound. It led them deeper into the forest, toward the place they had always avoided, the old graveyard. Over the years, the town had whispered countless stories about the graveyard. Tales of wandering spirits, strange lights in the night, and the inexplicable feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The iron gates of the graveyard creaked open as they approached, the rusted hinges groaning in protest as if warning them to turn back. But the cry beckoned them forward. The fog thickened as they entered, swirling around the tombstones, the air growing colder with each step. Mrs. Thompson's heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but she couldn't stop. She had to know where the sound was coming from. They walked between rows of ancient, weathered gravestones, their names long faded, their histories forgotten. The wind howled through the trees, but underneath it, they could still hear the faint wail of a baby. It was coming from the far end of the graveyard, where the oldest graves lay forgotten, overgrown, and shrouded in darkness. There Mr. Thompson whispered, pointing toward a crumbling mausoleum covered in thick ivy. At its base, barely visible in the dim moonlight, was a small bundle of tattered cloth wrapped around something. Mrs. Thompson felt her blood run cold. "Oh God," she gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. It's a baby." The couple approached cautiously, the eerie quiet of the graveyard broken only by the baby's soft whimpering. Mr. Thompson knelt down, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the bundle. As soon as his fingers brushed the cloth, the baby stopped crying. A deathly silence fell over the graveyard, so heavy that it seemed to smother the very air around them. Mrs. Thompson's heart hammered in her chest as she peered over her husband's shoulder. The baby was pale, unnaturally so, its skin nearly translucent in the moonlight. Its eyes, wide and unblinking, stared up at them dark, deep, and impossibly calm for a newborn. "We can't leave him here," Mrs. Thompson whispered, though the words felt foreign on her tongue. Her instinct told her to turn away, to leave this place, but something stronger compelled her to stay. She looked at her husband, his face ashen and tense. "Who would leave a baby in a place like this?" Mr. Thompson murmured, his voice barely audible. His hands were shaking as he carefully lifted the infant from the ground. The child was cold to the touch, and for a brief moment he feared the worst, that the baby was already dead. But then it moved ever so slightly, letting out a soft, almost ethereal breath. "John," Mrs. Thompson said suddenly, her voice firmer than before. "We'll name him John." Mr. Thompson nodded, though his mind raced with 1,000 unanswered questions. What kind of person would abandon a child in a graveyard? And why did it feel like the very earth beneath them was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen? The wind picked up again, colder this time, biting at their skin as they wrapped the baby in a clean blanket they had brought with them. As they turned to leave, Mrs. Thompson glanced back at the mausoleum, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, only the looming, silent graves, watching as they carried the child away. The journey home was unsettling. The trees seemed to close in on them, the fog thickening around their legs as they hurried back down the path. The baby was silent in Mr. Thompson's arms, its wide eyes fixed on something beyond the darkness. Mrs. Thompson kept glancing over her shoulder, feeling the weight of invisible eyes on her back, but there was no one there. Still, the sensation of being watched clung to her like a second skin, and the oppressive atmosphere of the graveyard followed them all the way home. Once inside, the warmth of the cottage should have brought comfort, but instead the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Mrs. Thompson lit the lamps, their flickering light casting strange, dancing shadows across the walls. The baby lay still in Mr. Thompson's arms, its small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "He's so quiet," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Too quiet." Her husband nodded, laying the child down in the small crib they had hastily prepared. The baby's eyes remained open, staring up at the ceiling, unblinking. The silence stretched between them, and with it an unspoken dread settled in the room. "Maybe he's just tired," Mr. Thompson offered weakly, though he knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. But they had already made their decision. This child, this strange, abandoned baby, was now theirs. The first night passed uneventfully, though neither of them slept well. The house creaked and groaned as if settling into the presence of its new inhabitant. Mrs. Thompson tossed and turned, waking several times with a start, convinced that she had heard footsteps outside the bedroom door. Each time she would hold her breath, listening intently, but the only sound that reached her ears was the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. When morning came, the baby was still there, lying in the crib, silent and unmoving. Mrs. Thompson knelt beside him, her hand trembling as she gently touched his cheek. His skin was cold, colder than it should have been. But he was breathing, and his eyes, those dark, bottomless eyes, were watching her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Over the next few days, the couple tried to adjust to their new life with John, but the unease never left them. The baby rarely cried, never fussed, and spent most of his time staring at the ceiling or out the window. Mrs. Thompson would find herself standing over his crib for hours, unable to tear her gaze away from his unnervingly calm face. "Something's not right," she whispered to her husband one evening as they sat by the fire. "He's different." Mr. Thompson didn't respond immediately. He had felt it too, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. Instead, he stared into the flames, watching as the fire danced and flickered, casting eerie shapes on the walls. "He's just a baby," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. He'll be fine, but the shadows that lingered at the edge of the firelight seemed to say otherwise. The house, once warm and inviting, now felt cold and foreign, as if something unseen had taken residence there. And the baby, with his unblinking eyes and eerie silence, was at the center of it all. As the days turned into weeks, the Thompsons began to notice strange things happening around the house. Objects would move on their own, chairs shifting slightly, doors creaking open without a breeze to move them. Mrs. Thompson swore she heard voices, faint whispers that came from nowhere, growing louder at night when the house was still. At first she tried to dismiss it as her imagination, but the occurrences became too frequent, too real to ignore. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of a woman's voice. "Give him back," it whispered, so faint that she thought she had dreamed it. But the voice came again, closer this time, and her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up, her hands clutching the blanket. "Edward," she whispered, shaking her husband awake. "Did you hear that?" He stirred, groggy and confused. "Hear what that voice," she said, her voice trembling. It said to give him back, mister." Thompson sat up, listening intently. But the house was silent, save for the wind outside. Just the wind, he muttered, lying back down. Go to sleep, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, her heart racing with fear. And downstairs in his crib, John lay perfectly still, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, waiting. This was only the beginning. Part 2. Strange happenings. The days following the discovery of baby John should have been a time of warmth and joy for the Thompsons. But instead, a suffocating sense of dread crept into their home, turning every breath, every glance, and every whisper into a chilling reminder that something was terribly wrong. At first it was subtle. Mrs. Thompson, ever the practical woman, dismissed the small occurrences as mere figments of her imagination. A chair that was slightly out of place, a door left ajar when she was sure she'd closed it. She attributed these things to her own forgetfulness. After all, caring for a baby was exhausting. But soon, the strange happenings became more frequent and more unnerving. One crisp autumn morning, Mrs. Thompson entered the nursery to check on John. He was asleep, as usual, lying peacefully in his crib. But something was different. A coldness hung in the air, so intense it seemed to freeze the breath in her lungs. The room was bathed in sunlight, yet she could see her breath clouding before her, as though the nursery had plunged into midwinter. She wrapped her arms around herself, her skin prickling with goosebumps. Her gaze swept the room, searching for an open window or some explanation for the frigid temperature. But the window was sealed shut. There was no draft, no reason for the unnatural cold. Suddenly the mobile above John's crib began to spin slowly, creaking as it turned. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat as she watched it move on its own, the little wooden animal spinning lazily in the cold, dead air. For a moment she could have sworn she heard a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind, but too soft to understand. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the crib. She shook her head, trying to rid herself of the irrational fear tightening around her throat. "It's nothing," she told herself. "It's just the stress of caring for a baby. I'm tired. I'm imagining things." But deep down she knew it was more than that. That evening the cold spots moved through the house, like a shadow of death creeping silently from room to room. In the hallway the temperature would drop suddenly, making the walls themselves seem to breathe with an icy chill. The kitchen, once warm and inviting, now felt hollow and strange, with cold tendrils wrapping around Mrs. Thompson's legs as she prepared dinner. Mr. Thompson, always the rational one, tried to make light of it. "It's just the weather," he'd say, though the unease in his voice was unmistakable. He'd laugh nervously, insisting that there was no reason to be afraid. But at night, as they lay in bed, the whispers returned, growing louder, clearer. "Give him back," the voices hissed from the corners of the room, from beneath the bed, from the darkened hallway outside their door. "He's not yours." Mrs. Thompson would grip her husband's arm, her heart racing in terror. "Do you hear that?" she'd whisper, her voice trembling. But every time Mr. Thompson listened, the house fell deathly silent. "It's just the wind," he would say, though he no longer believed his own words. As the months passed, John began to grow, but not like other children. He was unnaturally quiet, rarely crying, rarely fussing, his dark, unblinking eyes watching everything with eerie intensity. He was a year old when he spoke his first word, but it wasn't Mama or Dada as they had hoped. Instead, late one night, as he lay in his crib, Mrs. Thompson heard him murmur a name in his sleep. Agnes, the name sent a chill down her spine. She crept closer to his crib, listening as he whispered again, "Agnes," waiting. Mrs. Thompson's heart pounded in her chest. She knew that name. Agnes had been the elderly woman who lived in the house down the road. She had passed away the previous week, her funeral held just days ago. Mrs. Thompson hadn't spoken of Agnes in front of John, and there was no way he could have known about her. He was too young, too innocent, wasn't he? She rushed back to bed, shaking her husband awake. "Edward," he said her name. "Agnes, how does he know?" Mr. Thompson, bleary-eyed and disoriented, mumbled something incoherent and pulled the blanket over his head. "It's just a coincidence," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. But it wasn't just a coincidence. Over the next few weeks, John began to speak more names, always in his sleep, always in that same eerie, whispering voice. The names were unfamiliar to Mrs. Thompson at first, but each one sent a shiver of dread through her bones. And then the deaths began. It started with old Mr. Cartwright, who lived across the street. One night John murmured his name in his sleep, a strange smile curling his lips. "Cartwright," soon he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. The very next morning Mrs. Thompson woke to the sound of church bells tolling. Mr. Cartwright had passed away in his sleep. Then it was Mrs. Melrose, the town seamstress, who had been perfectly healthy just days before. John spoke her name one night, and within 48 hours she was found dead in her home. The pattern became unmistakable. Each name that left John's lips was followed by death. It was as though he could see the thin veil between life and death, and was simply watching as it unraveled, one thread at a time. Mrs. Thompson grew pale and gaunt, her nights restless, haunted by the voices that plagued her sleep, and the creeping cold that never seemed to leave the house. She feared her own child, this small, quiet boy with eyes that seemed to see beyond the veil of the living. Every time he spoke in his sleep, her heart would freeze, dreading the sound of the next name that would pass his lips. The townsfolk began to notice the strange happenings around the Thompson house. Whispers spread through the village like wildfire. Some said the child was cursed, a demon sent to bring death and misfortune. Others claimed they had seen strange shadows moving in the windows at night, heard unearthly noises that no human could have made. It wasn't long before the neighbors grew distant. They no longer visited the Thompsons, no longer offered kind words or curious glances at little John. Fear had taken root, and with it came isolation. Mrs. Thompson no longer went to town for supplies. She couldn't bear the accusing stares, the murmured words that followed her every step. She knew they were right. Something was wrong with John, something far worse than they could ever imagine. One night, as the wind howled outside and the house creaked under its weight, John spoke a name that sent ice through Mrs. Thompson's veins. "Edward," he whispered. Mrs. Thompson shot up in bed, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. She stared at John's crib in the corner of the room, her heart hammering in her chest. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, please no," but John's soft, eerie voice drifted through the room again. "Edward, soon." Terror clutched at Mrs. Thompson's heart. She turned to her husband, who lay peacefully beside her, unaware of the death sentence that had just been whispered into the night. She shook him awake, tears streaming down her face, her voice trembling with desperation. "He said your name," she sobbed. "He said your name, Edward. Please, we have to leave. We have to get out of here, Mr. Thompson. though rattled by his wife's panic, tried to calm her. He held her trembling hands and whispered soothing words, but inside his stomach churned with fear. He had heard John speak in his sleep before, had seen the chilling accuracy of his words. But he couldn't accept it, not now, not when his own name had been uttered. The following day, Mr. Thompson did not leave for work. He stayed by his wife's side, casting nervous glances at John, who played quietly in his crib, as if oblivious to the terror that surrounded him. They waited in a tense, anxious silence, hearts pounding with every tick of the clock. But nothing happened. The hours dragged on, the oppressive weight of dread pressing down on them. The sun set, and still there was no sign of danger, no sudden illness, no accident, no unnatural event. Mr. Thompson began to relax, convincing himself that perhaps, just this once, John's prediction had been wrong. That night they went to bed, the tension still lingering in the air, though not as suffocating as before. Mrs. Thompson clutched her husband's hand beneath the covers, her heart heavy with fear. She stayed awake for hours, listening for any sign, any whisper, any movement in the darkness. But eventually exhaustion overcame her, and she drifted into a restless sleep. It was the smell that woke her, a sharp, acrid scent that filled her nose and burned the back of her throat. She bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. The room was bathed in a faint orange glow flickering, dancing shadows cast on the walls. Fire! Edward, she screamed, shaking him awake. But as she turned, she realized something was terribly, horribly wrong. Her husband lay still, his face pale, his chest unmoving. The fire crackled louder now, creeping through the walls, and a low, distant voice echoed in her ears, John's voice, whispering from the corner of the room. Soon Mrs. Thompson's scream was swallowed by the flames as they consumed everything around her. And John, he simply watched, his dark eyes reflecting the flames, unblinking. Part 3. A Supernatural Connection. The sun had barely risen over the Thompsons' quiet, isolated home when Mrs. Thompson finally made the decision that had been haunting her for weeks. She had seen too many strange things, heard too many unexplainable whispers, and felt an ever-growing darkness that seemed to cling to the very air of their once welcoming house. The final straw had been John's eerie prediction, the way he had whispered his father's name, as if the boy held some forbidden knowledge, a secret too dark for his innocent lips. The house had become a prison of fear. Cold spots lingered in every corner, and objects continued to move on their own, sometimes small things like a teacup shifting on the table, and sometimes much more unnerving incidents. The night before, the heavy grandfather clock in the hallway had chimed midnight, even though it had not worked in years. Every night brought something new, something darker. Mrs. Thompson couldn't take it anymore. It was time to seek help. She had heard of a spiritual healer who lived on the outskirts of the next town, a woman said to have a gift for understanding the strange, the unexplainable. Her name was Agnes Browning, and though Mrs. Thompson had been skeptical at first, the growing terror in her own home had driven her to desperation. She had seen John's unsettling behavior too many times. There was something about her son, something that was no longer just unsettling, but terrifying. When Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Thompson arrived at Agnes Browning's house, they found it nestled deep in the woods, far away from the prying eyes of the town. The house was old and covered in creeping vines, its windows dark and foreboding. The wind howled through the trees as they approached, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Mrs. Thompson held John tightly in her arms as they knocked on the heavy wooden door. She couldn't help but notice how calm John was, how he seemed completely unaffected by the cold, by the fear that twisted in her gut, by the dark presence that seemed to follow them everywhere. The door creaked open, revealing Agnes Browning. She was an older woman, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and piercing. She looked at the Thompsons with a knowing expression, as though she had been expecting them. "I know why you're here," Agnes said, her voice low and gravelly. "Come in." The couple exchanged nervous glances before stepping inside. The interior of Agnes's home was dimly lit by flickering candles, the smell of burning incense heavy in the air. Strange trinkets and symbols adorned the walls, objects that seemed ancient, with meanings lost to time. A chill ran down Mrs. Thompson's spine as she followed Agnes to a small room in the back of the house, where they were told to sit. Agnes took one long look at John, who remained eerily still in his mother's arms. "He's different," she said softly, her gaze never leaving the boy. "I felt it the moment you knocked on my door, Mrs." Thompson's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean? What's wrong with him?" Agnes turned her sharp eyes toward the couple. "Your son is not like other children. He has a connection to the dead." Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale. "What kind of connection?" Agnes leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The dead are drawn to him. He can feel them, hear them, sometimes even see them. And in return they are drawn to him like moths to a flame." Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. She clutched John tighter, her mind racing. "But why? Why him?" Agnes studied the boy with a solemn expression. "Some souls are born with this connection. It's not something you can choose or control. It's ancient, older than any of us, and it runs deep in his blood. Spirits are drawn to him because they know he can hear them, and they want his help. Sometimes they want more than that. More than that." Mrs. Thompson's heart raced in her chest as Agnes' words sank in. The thought that her child, her sweet little John, was a beacon for the dead. How could this be? She had noticed the strange occurrences, but to hear it confirmed was another level of fear entirely. Agnes seemed to sense her rising panic. She raised a hand, her voice firm but gentle. "You must understand your son is not evil. He's not cursed. But his connection to the other side is strong, and you must be careful. The dead, they are not always kind. They are not always what they seem." Mrs. Thompson's throat tightened. "But what can we do? How do we protect him?" Agnes looked down at John again, who was gazing around the room as if he could see things no one else could. "You must be cautious," she said. "The spirits are already here, watching him. Some are harmless, but others will seek to use him. The more attention you give this, the stronger the connection becomes. Continue raising him with love, but always be vigilant. You will need to teach him to protect himself when the time comes." Mrs. Thompson nodded, though her stomach churned with dread. How could they teach a child to protect himself from the unseen? How could they live in a house where the very air seemed thick with the presence of the dead? "Is there anything we can do now?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice breaking with desperation. Agnes stood slowly and crossed the room to a small shelf. She took down a bundle of dried herbs and a small, intricately carved talisman. "This," she said, handing them to Mrs. Thompson, "will help ward off the spirits that mean harm. Burn these herbs every evening and keep the talisman near his bed. It won't stop everything, but it will provide some protection." Mrs. Thompson took the items with trembling hands, her mind racing with questions. "And if it doesn't work?" Agnes' gaze darkened, her voice quiet. "Then you must be prepared for what comes." The drive back home was silent, the weight of Agnes's words pressing heavily on them. John sat quietly in the back seat, his dark eyes watching the trees whip past the window as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Mrs. Thompson clutched the talisman in her lap, her knuckles white as she stared out at the darkening sky. She could feel it, that same presence she had felt in Agnes's house. It was following them, something invisible but palpable, something cold and ancient, creeping through the trees and pressing in on the car like a vice. When they returned home, the house felt different, heavier, darker. The wind howled outside, and the familiar chill settled once again into the corners of the rooms. Mrs. Thompson wasted no time. She lit the herbs Agnes had given her, watching as the smoke curled into the air and filled the house with its thick herbal scent. The talisman was placed beside John's crib, its strange carvings catching the dim light of the flickering candles. But despite their precautions, the air still felt charged with something unnatural, something that watched and waited just beyond the edges of their sight. In the weeks that followed, the strange occurrences continued, though there was a shift. The whispers became more persistent, the cold spots more intense. Sometimes in the middle of the night, Mrs. Thompson would wake to the sound of soft footsteps just outside the door, footsteps that stopped when she got out of bed, leaving nothing but silence behind. John, meanwhile, remained as calm and unnervingly quiet as ever. He still rarely cried, and when he spoke, it was often in strange riddles or words that made no sense. He began to talk more often in his sleep, his small voice whispering things that chilled his parents to the bone. One night, as Mrs. Thompson stood outside his room, listening to him murmur in his sleep, she heard him whisper something that froze her blood. "They're waiting for me," the words were spoken in that same strange, detached tone, as though John wasn't fully awake, but their meaning was clear. Mrs. Thompson clutched the doorframe, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to wake him, to shake him and tell him that nothing was waiting for him, that everything was fine. But she couldn't move. Fear held her rooted to the spot, her breath coming in shallow gasps as John continued to whisper. "They're waiting. They're calling me," her mind raced. Who was waiting for him? What did they want? She had followed Agnes's instructions to the letter, had burned the herbs every night, had kept the talisman close, and yet the darkness still lingered, the spirit still watched. It was as though they were drawn to John more and more with each passing day. As the days blurred into weeks, the Thompsons' fear grew, but so did their love for John. Despite the strange and terrifying things happening around them, he was still their child, the little boy they had longed for, the boy they had adopted and promised to love. And love him they did, fiercely and protectively. But there was no denying the change in him. His eyes, once wide and curious, had taken on an unsettling depth, as though he could see things no one else could. His laughter, when it came, was rare and hollow, and his gaze lingered too long on the shadows that crept across the floor at night. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, John suddenly looked up from his plate, his dark eyes locking onto Mrs. Thompson's. "They're coming soon," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. Mrs. Thompson dropped her fork, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who's coming?" John smiled, a slow, eerie smile that sent a chill down her spine. "You'll see." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. And somewhere in the distance, just beyond the edge of their world, the spirit stirred, waiting for the moment when the veil between the living and the dead would tear apart. Part 4. Conversations with Spirits. The Thompson house had become a place of secrets, whispers, and a growing, suffocating dread. Mrs. Thompson no longer felt safe, not even in the daylight. The shadows crept closer each day, and the feeling of being watched never left her. But it wasn't just the sense of unease that troubled her, it was John. Her beloved adopted son, once a quiet, strange child, had begun talking. Not to her husband, but to them. It started subtly at first. John would sit alone in his room, mumbling under his breath, eyes fixed on something unseen in the corner. When Mrs. Thompson asked him who he was talking to, he would smile, a smile that chilled her to the bone, and say, "My friends." But the way he said it, with that distant, eerie calm, made her stomach twist. At first she tried to dismiss it. Children had imaginary friends. It was normal, wasn't it? She wanted to believe that so desperately. But soon, John's conversations became more frequent, more disturbing. The tone of his voice changed, shifting from a soft murmur to something darker, something filled with malice. He wasn't playing pretend anymore. He was speaking to someone, and they were speaking back. One night, as Mrs. Thompson was walking down the hallway, she heard John's voice coming from his room, but it wasn't the quiet, innocent tone of a child. His voice was low, serious, sounded as though he was having a conversation with an adult. But curiosity and fear drew her closer. She stopped outside his door, her hand hovering above the doorknob. Her heart raced as she listened. "But they don't like you," John said, his voice so calm it was unnerving. There was a pause, as though someone had responded to him, though Mrs. Thompson could hear nothing but John's side of the conversation. "I know they want to hurt us," John continued, his voice darker now. "But I told them they can't." Not yet. Mrs. Thompson's blood ran cold. She slowly pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. John was sitting in the middle of the floor, facing the window. His back was to her, and in the dim light he appeared to be staring at something only he could see. The room was unbearably cold, a chill that seeped into her bones. She watched, frozen in place, as John tilted his head slightly, as though listening intently to whatever or whoever was speaking to him. "They're angry," John said quietly. "They don't like being here, but I told them they have to wait." Mrs. Thompson's breath hitched in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The air around her felt thick with an invisible, oppressive force. It pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Then John's head slowly turned toward the door. His eyes met hers, and for a moment Mrs. Thompson felt as though her heart had stopped. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, there was something in them, something dark and knowing, far too old for a child of his age. "They're here, Mom," John whispered. "They've been here for a long time." Her body stiffened. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave the house and never look back, but she couldn't abandon John. Despite everything, he was still her son. She forced herself to step into the room, the cold enveloping her like a shroud. "Who's here, John?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who are you talking to?" John smiled, a slow, eerie smile that stretched too wide across his face. "The spirits. They talk to me every night." Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. "What do they want?" John's smile faltered for a moment, his gaze shifting toward the corner of the room. He stared at the shadows, his expression serious. "There's one spirit," he said quietly. "He's different from the others. He's angry. He wants to hurt us." Mrs. Thompson's blood turned to ice. "Why, John? Why does he want to hurt us?" John's eyes flicked back to hers, his expression unnervingly calm. "Because he's trapped. And he blames you?" The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker, the cold more intense. She wanted to ask what John meant, but she couldn't find the words. A deep primal fear gripped her heart. She knew deep down that whatever was in their home wasn't just a figment of John's imagination. It was real. That night, Mrs. Thompson couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of John's words. A trapped spirit, anger, blame. The words echoed in her mind, feeding the terror that had taken root in her heart. She could no longer pretend that this was just a phase, just a child's imagination. Something dark had attached itself to their home and to John. In the stillness of the night she heard it again, the whispering. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Voices, several of them murmuring just outside the bedroom door. Mrs. Thompson's breath quickened as she turned toward Mr. Thompson, but he was fast asleep, oblivious to the eerie sounds creeping through the house. She sat up slowly, her eyes fixed on the door. The voices grew louder, a cacophony of whispers that seemed to fill the room. And then, over the whispers, she heard John's voice. "They're here again, Mom." She gasped, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. John was standing in the doorway, his small figure barely visible in the dim light. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, unblinking, as he stared at her. "They are angry tonight," he said softly, almost as if he were apologizing. Before Mrs. Thompson could respond, a shadow moved behind John. It was quick, so fast that she almost thought she had imagined it, but then it moved again. A dark, looming figure hovering just above the floor, its form twisting and undulating like smoke. For a moment Mrs. Thompson was paralyzed with fear. The shadow grew darker, more defined, and she could feel the malevolence radiating from it, the hatred that seemed to seep from its very being. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. All she could do was watch in horror as the shadow drifted closer to John, its presence heavy and suffocating. It hovered just behind him, its shape shifting and morphing, as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. But the eyes, dark, hollow eyes, stared directly at her. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. Her body trembled as the shadow reached out, its long, dark tendrils brushing against John's hair. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The shadow froze for a moment, as if it had heard her, and then it vanished. Just like that, it dissolved into the air, leaving nothing but the lingering cold and an oppressive silence in its wake. John blinked up at her, his expression calm, almost serene. "He'll be back," he said matter-of-factly. "He's always watching." The following morning, Mrs. Thompson tried to rationalize what she had seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the moon through the window. Maybe the stress of the past few months had finally taken its toll on her mind. But deep down she knew the truth. That shadow wasn't a figment of her imagination. It was real. Her hands shook as she prepared breakfast, her thoughts consumed by the events of the previous night. She couldn't shake the image of that shadow, the way it had hovered so closely to John, the way it had seemed to reach for him, almost protectively. John sat at the table, quietly eating his cereal, seemingly unaffected by the fear that gripped his mother. He glanced up at her with those dark, knowing eyes and smiled a smile that made her stomach churn with unease. "Mom," he said, his voice soft and innocent, "he's not gone. He's still here." Mrs. Thompson's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't need to ask who he was. She already knew. "He doesn't like you," John continued, his tone casual, as though he were discussing the weather. "He says you shouldn't have taken me." Her blood ran cold. She placed the plate she was holding down on the counter, her hands trembling. "What do you mean?" John's smile faded slightly. "He's mad because I'm not supposed to be here. He says I belong to him." A wave of nausea washed over Mrs. Thompson. She backed away from the counter, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller, the air suffocating. John watched her closely, his expression unreadable. "He wants me back," the words echoed in the silence, filling the space between them with a heavy, terrifying truth. Mrs. Thompson's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the floor, her hands clutching at her chest as she struggled to catch her breath. John's voice, calm and cold, cut through the haze of her panic. "He says it'll come for me soon." Part 5. The Dark Prediction. The days leading up to John's 10th birthday were thick with an unsettling stillness, like the calm before a storm. The Thompson household had grown even colder, more oppressive, as if the very walls held their breath in anticipation. Mrs. Thompson could feel it in her bones, a creeping sense of dread that seemed to cling to her every waking moment. John had always been different, but lately, his strangeness had taken on a sharper edge, one that cut deeper with every passing day. His birthday approached like a shadow, dark and foreboding. It wasn't just an ordinary day anymore. There was something else lurking beneath it, something darker, something inevitable. And that something began to reveal itself on the night before John turned 10. It was a cold, still evening, with the wind howling softly outside the Thompson house. Mrs. Thompson stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, trying to ignore the unsettling quiet that had taken over their home. John was in the living room, sitting on the floor, playing quietly with a set of old wooden blocks, his dark eyes fixed on them, as if seeing something she could not. Suddenly, without warning, John spoke. "Mr. Harris is going to die." The spoon slipped from Mrs. Thompson's fingers, clattering loudly against the pot. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "What did you say?" John didn't look up. He continued stacking his blocks, his movements slow and deliberate. "He's going to die. Tomorrow." Mrs. Thompson's mouth went dry. "Mr. Harris was the town's most notorious figure, a cruel, ruthless landowner who had terrorized the townspeople for years. He was a man of power, feared and despised in equal measure. But John's words cut through the air like a knife, and Mrs. Thompson felt a shiver of fear crawl up her spine. "John," she said, her voice trembling, "you shouldn't say things like that." John finally looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. But it's true, he'll be murdered. Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. Murdered. The word hung in the air, heavy and chilling. She stared at her son, trying to comprehend the weight of what he had just said. There was no malice in his voice, no emotion, just a simple statement of fact, as though he were commenting on the weather. She wanted to dismiss it, to tell herself that it was just the imagination of a child. But deep down she knew better. John had always been different, and his predictions always came true. That night, sleep was elusive for Mrs. Thompson. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, John's words echoing in her mind. He'll be murdered. The room felt too cold, too quiet, and every creak of the old house sent her heart racing. She turned to look at Mr. Thompson, who was snoring softly beside her, blissfully unaware of the darkness that seemed to be closing in around them. Unable to shake the growing sense of unease, Mrs. Thompson slipped out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway. She paused outside John's room, listening. It was silent. Too silent. She opened the door slowly, her breath catching in her throat. John was sitting up in bed, his eyes open, staring straight ahead. "John," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't respond. He just sat there, unmoving, his eyes wide and dark, as though he was seeing something beyond the walls of their home. Something terrifying. Mrs. Thompson's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to wake him, to shake him from whatever nightmare had taken hold of him, but something stopped her, something cold and primal. Suddenly John blinked and turned to look at her. His gaze was calm, eerily calm. "He's already dead," John said softly. "You'll see." Mrs. Thompson's blood ran cold. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, and shut the door quietly behind her. The air around her felt thick, oppressive, as though the very house itself had become a living thing, watching her, waiting. The next morning the town was buzzing with news. Mr. Harris had been found dead in his home, murdered in cold blood. The news hit like a lightning strike, sending shockwaves through the quiet, sleepy town. The townspeople gathered in small clusters, whispering and speculating, their faces pale with fear. No one knew who had done it. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses. It was as if death itself had crept into Mr. Harris's home and taken him at night. But the whispers soon turned to John. It didn't take long for the townspeople to learn that John had predicted the death the night before. The Thompsons tried to keep it quiet, but secrets had a way of spreading, and soon the whole town knew. John had predicted Mr. Harris's death, and it had come true. The fear surrounding John grew like wildfire. What had once been a quiet suspicion of the boy's strange abilities now exploded into full-blown terror. The townspeople began to avoid the Thompson household, crossing the street whenever they saw Mrs. Thompson in the market. Whispers followed her wherever she went, whispers of curses and dark magic. Inside their home the atmosphere had shifted. Mr. Thompson tried to carry on as usual, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was looming over them, something far darker than anything they had experienced before. John, for his part, seemed unfazed. He went about his days as if nothing had changed, but Mrs. Thompson noticed the way he would occasionally stare off into the distance, his eyes unfocused, as though he were listening to something only he could hear. And then there were the voices. The whispers that had once only haunted the night were now growing louder, more insistent. Mrs. Thompson would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, shadows that weren't there, figures that seemed to disappear the moment she turned her head. A week after Mr. Harris's murder, Mrs. Thompson was sitting in the living room, trying to sew, her hands trembling too much to hold the needle steady. John sat across from her, playing with his blocks, stacking them with careful precision. "Mom," John said suddenly, his voice cutting through the stillness. Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. "Yes, John, there's going to be another one." Her blood turned to ice. Another what? John smiled, a slow, eerie smile that sent a shiver down her spine. Another death. Mrs. Thompson's hand shook as she set the sewing down, her heart racing in her chest. Who, John? Who's going to die? John didn't answer. He simply turned back to his blocks, humming softly to himself. The days passed in a blur of fear and dread. Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming, something even worse than Mr. Harris's murder. The townspeople had grown more distant, more fearful. Some had even begun whispering about curses, about the need to protect themselves from whatever dark power John seemed to possess. And then it happened. One night, as the town lay silent under the heavy weight of fear, a second death struck. Mrs. Abernathy, a sweet, elderly woman who lived alone at the edge of town, was found dead in her bed, her face twisted in a grimace of terror. The townspeople were in an uproar. 2 deaths in such a short span of time, both of them predicted by John. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over, spilling into the streets. People were afraid to leave their homes after dark, afraid to speak John's name aloud. But it wasn't just the fear of death that gripped the town, it was the growing realization that John knew more than any child should. He knew too much. And whatever was speaking to him, whatever dark force had attached itself to him, was growing stronger. The Thompson house had become a prison. Mrs. Thompson no longer ventured into town, no longer spoke to the neighbors. She spent her days watching John, waiting for the next prediction, the next dark omen that would send their lives spiraling further into terror. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the yard, Mrs. Thompson stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the gathering dusk. John was outside, playing in the dirt, his back to her. Suddenly he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned to face the house, his dark eyes locking onto hers through the glass. "They're coming for me," he said softly, his voice carrying on the wind. Mrs. Thompson's heart clenched in her chest. "Who?" John smiled, that eerie, unsettling smile. "The ones who are angry. They want me back." Terror gripped her, freezing her in place. She could feel the cold creeping into her bones, the same cold that had been with them since John's arrival. But now it was worse, deeper, darker, as if something was about to break free from the shadows. And then, without another word, John turned and walked into the growing darkness, disappearing into the night. The following morning, the townspeople woke to find that another death had occurred. This time it was the town's pastor, a kind man who had spent his life trying to protect the townspeople from evil. But no one could protect them now. The whispers of the spirits grew louder, more insistent, as if they were no longer satisfied with merely speaking through John. They wanted more. They wanted blood. And John knew it. Mrs. Thompson could feel the darkness closing in on them, a suffocating force that seemed to press down on her with each passing day. She knew that John's predictions weren't just accidents, that the spirits he spoke to were real, and they were growing stronger. But she couldn't abandon him. He was still her son, still the boy she had raised and loved. Even as the fear gnawed at her, even as the town turned against them, she couldn't leave him. But deep down she knew that the darkness wouldn't stop until it had claimed what it wanted. And John was at the center of it all. Part 6. Uncovering the Truth. The Thompson house was drenched in a thick, unyielding silence. The kind of silence that made every creak in the floorboards sound like a scream, every gust of wind against the windows feel like a whisper from the dead. Mrs. Thompson, who once found solace in the quaint isolation of their countryside home, now dreaded every evening when shadows stretched long and dark across the walls, growing darker still in the presence of her son John. Her fingers trembled as she folded a shirt from the laundry pile, but it wasn't the cold that caused her hands to shake. It was fear, deep, unrelenting fear that had been gnawing at her ever since John's 10th birthday, ever since his prediction of Mr. Harris's death had come true. The town had turned against them. Whispers followed Mrs. Thompson wherever she went. Eyes filled with suspicion bore into her, and neighbors kept their distance, as if the Thompsons carried a plague. But it wasn't the town's judgment that truly terrified her. It was John. Her sweet, strange boy, who had been different from the moment they found him, swaddled and silent, near the graveyard. That graveyard. The memory of that night tugged at the back of her mind like a persistent, unanswered question. Why had he been left there? And why did everything around John feel as if it were rotting slowly from the inside out? The air in their house had grown colder, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were slowly suffocating under the weight of an invisible presence. One day, after the second strange death in town, Mrs. Thompson could bear it no longer. She had to find answers or the fear would devour her whole. She called her husband, his voice tinged with the same dread that she had tried so hard to keep hidden. "We have to know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We have to find out where John came from." Mr. Thompson, a stoic man of few words, didn't argue. He had seen the fear in his wife's eyes, and worse, he had begun to feel it himself. John's abilities were no longer just eerie coincidences. Something was deeply, unnaturally wrong with their son. And so they began their search. Their investigation started innocently enough. They visited the town's records office, looking for any birth records, anything that could explain who John's parents were. But the clerk, a hunched-over man with cloudy eyes, had no answers. There were no records of a birth near the graveyard, no reports of a missing infant. Frustrated but undeterred, the Thompsons pressed on. They spoke to the local priest, to midwives, and even to a few of the older women in town who had long been the keepers of gossip. But no one had any useful information. It wasn't until one evening, when the sun had dipped below the horizon and the shadows were growing long, that they found the first real clue. Mrs. Abernathy, the town's oldest resident and keeper of more secrets than anyone could ever imagine, lived in a small, crumbling house on the edge of the town. Her mind had been sharp in her youth, but age had turned her into a recluse. Few bothered to visit her anymore, fearing the ramblings of an old woman who often spoke of spirits and curses. The Thompsons, however, had no other options left. They knocked on her door, hesitating as they waited. The wind howled softly through the trees, and Mrs. Thompson pulled her coat tighter around herself, the chill biting through her skin. The door creaked open slowly, revealing Mrs. Abernathy, her gnarled hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. Her eyes, though milky with age, seemed to bore into them with unsettling clarity. "You've come for the truth, haven't you?" she rasped, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "About the boy, Mrs." Thompson swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Please, we need to know where he came from." Mrs. Abernathy motioned for them to enter, and they stepped into the dimly lit house, the air thick with the scent of age and dust. The old woman shuffled to a worn chair by the fireplace and gestured for them to sit across from her. The fire flickered weakly, casting shadows that danced unnervingly across the walls. "You found him near the graveyard," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice low and deliberate. "Yes," Mr. Thompson replied. "He was abandoned there." The old woman let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Abandoned? No, not abandoned. He wasn't left there by chance. He was born there." Mrs. Thompson felt her blood turn to ice. "Born there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Abernathy nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. "His mother died there, alone. She was one of Harris's victims. You see, at the mention of Mr. Harris's name, Mrs. Thompson stiffened, her heart pounding even harder. "Harris? What do you mean?" Mrs. Abernathy's face twisted into a grimace, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if speaking the name would summon something dark from the shadows. "Mr. Harris was not just a landowner. He was a monster, and everyone in this town knew it. But we were all too afraid to stand up to him. He took what he wanted: land, money, and sometimes more. The woman who gave birth to John was one of his victims. He took her by force, and when she found herself with child, she had nowhere to go. No one would help her." Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. "What happened to her?" "She died alone in that graveyard," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice hardening. "Her body wasn't found for days, and by then it was too late, but the baby survived. Somehow, Against all odds, the baby survived. Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his voice tight with urgency. John was born there, but how did he end up in our care? The old woman's eyes gleamed with something dark, something that made Mrs. Thompson's skin crawl, because she wanted him to survive, but she couldn't let go. Her spirit has attached itself to him, using him to exact her revenge. Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. Revenge, Mrs. Abernathy nodded, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The deaths that have followed John are no coincidence. She is using him, speaking through him, to punish those who wronged her. Harris was the first, but it won't stop there. A sickening wave of realization washed over Mrs. Thompson, and she felt the room spinning around her. The predictions, the cold spots, the voices, they weren't just strange occurrences. They were the manifestations of a vengeful spirit, a spirit that had latched onto her son from the moment of his birth. But why, John? Mr. Thompson asked, his voice strained. Why would she use her own child like this? Mrs. Abernathy leaned forward, her eyes glittering with something almost predatory. Because he is her tether. Without him, she would be lost. Her anger, her hatred, her sorrow, they all live through him now. He is her weapon. Mrs. Thompson felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. Is there any way to stop it? The old woman's face darkened. We can't stop it, not unless you're willing to give her what she wants. And what does she want? Mrs. Thompson's voice trembled as she asked the question. Even though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer, she wants justice. She wants those who wronged her to suffer. And until they do, John will be her tool. He will bring death and destruction to anyone who crosses her path. A cold, heavy silence fell over the room, and Mrs. Thompson's heart sank into her chest. The weight of the truth pressed down on her, suffocating her with its darkness. She had known that John was special, different from the other children, but she hadn't realized just how deeply the darkness had taken root within him. Now, as she sat in the flickering light of the old woman's fire, she could feel it, an ancient, vengeful force lurking in the shadows, waiting, watching. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper, as if something unseen was drawing closer. John was her son. She had raised him, loved him, cared for him. But now, as the truth unfolded before her, Mrs. Thompson felt a gnawing terror that threatened to consume her. John was not just a boy. He was the vessel for something far darker, something that had been set in motion long before they had found him in the graveyard. Mrs. Abernathy's voice cut through the silence like a knife. You have a choice, she said softly. You can try to break the connection, but it won't be easy. The spirit won't let go of him so easily. Mrs. Thompson looked at her husband, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. The weight of the decision pressed down on them both like an unbearable burden. Could they truly save John, or was it already too late? As they left Mrs. Abernathy's house that night, the wind howled through the trees, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The Thompsons walked in silence, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what they had uncovered. But as they neared their home, Mrs. Thompson felt something shift in the air, a coldness that seeped into her bones, a presence that seemed to cling to her like a shadow. The house loomed before them, dark and foreboding, as if it had been waiting for them. And as they stepped through the door, Mrs. Thompson knew, deep down, that the darkness had already taken hold. John was at the center of it all, and there was no escaping it, not now, not ever. Part 7. The Spirit's Wrath. The air inside the Thompson home had become heavy, oppressive, and thick with dread. What was once a peaceful place of warmth and love had turned into a prison of fear, each room suffused with an unseen malice. The house creaked and groaned like an old ship adrift in a storm, as if the very walls were straining against the malevolent force that had seeped into every crack, every corner. Mrs. Thompson stood by the kitchen window, staring out into the dark yard. Her breath fogged the glass as her fingers trembled against the cold sill. Outside, the night seemed too quiet, unnaturally so. Not a single bird called, nor did the wind stir the leaves. It was as if the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. She couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. Something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the faint porch light. Something that didn't belong to the living world. And though she could not see it, she could feel it. The spirit of John's mother was no longer content to remain in the shadows. She wanted her son back, and she would stop at nothing to reclaim him. A floorboard creaked behind her, and Mrs. Thompson whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. There was nothing there, just the flickering light of the old gas lamp that hung above the dining table, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. But the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the air had taken on a sharp, icy edge. Her hand went to her chest, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was terror, pure and unrelenting. Something was in the house with them, something that wasn't bound by the laws of the living. Footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway, slow, deliberate, and heavier than they should have been. They reverberated through the house, sending a shiver of dread crawling up Mrs. Thompson's spine. She knew those footsteps didn't belong to her husband or to John. For weeks now, strange occurrences had intensified. The lights would flicker erratically. Objects would be found moved from where they had been left. The cold spots in the house had grown so severe that the temperature sometimes felt like the dead of winter, even in the middle of summer. But it wasn't just the physical disturbances that terrified her, it was the feeling. The constant gnawing sensation that something was watching, waiting. At first they had told themselves it was just the stress, the lingering shock of discovering the truth about John's mother. But now it was impossible to ignore. The spirit was growing bolder, more demanding, and her presence could no longer be denied. Mrs. Thompson moved toward the hallway, her steps hesitant, every fiber of her being screaming for her to turn back. But she couldn't leave John alone. She wouldn't. No matter what this spirit wanted, John was still her son. The hallway stretched before her like a tunnel, dimly lit by the flickering gas lamps. The further she walked, the colder the air became, until it felt like she was stepping into the heart of winter. Frost had begun to form along the baseboards, and her breath fogged in front of her as she moved closer to John's bedroom door. A faint sound drifted to her ears, whispering. It was low, almost unintelligible, but it was there, creeping through the walls like a venomous hiss. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable anger, grief, and something darker, a mother's rage. Mrs. Thompson reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling as she gripped the cold brass. The door felt impossibly heavy as she pushed it open, as if the very weight of the spirit's presence pressed against it from the other side. Inside, John lay in his bed, seemingly asleep. His small body was curled beneath the blankets, his chest rising and falling in steady breaths. But the room itself was wrong, so wrong. The temperature had plummeted, and the frost now coated the windows in thick, spidery patterns. The lamp by John's bedside flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow that barely penetrated the heavy darkness pressing in from all sides. But worst of all was the figure standing at the foot of John's bed. It was her, John's mother. The spirit was barely more than a shadow, but her outline was clear, too clear. Her hair hung in long, tangled strands, matted with what looked like dried blood. Her dress, once white, was now stained and tattered, clinging to her thin, gaunt frame. But her face was a mask of sorrow and fury, her hollow eyes fixed on John with a cold, possessive glare. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the apparition, her body frozen in place. She had known this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer terror of seeing the spirit in the flesh or what passed for it. The spirit turned its gaze toward her, and for a moment the air itself seemed to still. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, but now Mrs. Thompson could understand it. "Give him back." The spirit hissed, her voice a haunting, otherworldly wail that seemed to echo from the very walls of the room. His mind, Mrs. Thompson's heart raced, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's our son. We found him. We've raised him." The spirit took a step forward, the temperature in the room dropping even further, until the very air felt like ice. "You cannot keep what belongs to the dead," she rasped, her voice cutting through the cold like a knife. "He was born of my pain, of my death. You cannot keep him from me." Tears filled Mrs. Thompson's eyes as she stood her ground, her maternal instinct clashing with the overwhelming terror that gripped her. "Please," she begged, her voice shaking. "We love him. He's a part of our family." The spirit's face twisted into a grotesque snarl, and suddenly the room erupted in a whirlwind of movement. The lamp by John's bed shattered, sending shards of glass across the floor. The frost on the windows thickened, cracking the glass as the temperature plunged even further. The walls groaned as if they were being pulled apart by some unseen force. John stirred in his sleep, his small body shivering beneath the blankets. Mrs. Thompson rushed to his side, wrapping her arms around him, pulling him close. But the spirit's presence grew stronger, more suffocating, as if the very air around them was being drained of life. The whispering grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, angry, mournful, desperate. They swirled around Mrs. Thompson and her son, threatening to tear them apart. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, as if the spirit was tightening its grip on the world of the living. "Give him back," the spirit shrieked, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "He belongs with me." Mrs. Thompson sobbed, clutching John tighter, her heart breaking under the weight of the spirit's wrath. "He's ours," she cried, her voice hoarse with desperation. "We can't take him." The room erupted into chaos. The bed shook violently, the floorboards creaking and splintering beneath their feet. The windows shattered, sending icy shards of glass raining down on them. The air itself seemed to howl with the spirit's fury, and for a moment Mrs. Thompson thought she could hear the faint, agonized wail of a woman crying out in grief. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The room fell silent. The cold lingered in the air, but the violent force that had torn through the house was gone. Mrs. Thompson's breath came in ragged gasps as she held John close, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. She looked up, her heart still racing, but the spirit was gone. The shadowy figure that had stood at the foot of John's bed had vanished, leaving behind only the lingering cold and the faint sound of the wind outside. But Mrs. Thompson knew this wasn't over. The spirit had retreated, but it hadn't left. It was still there, watching, waiting. It wanted John, and it would return. There was no doubt in her mind. She looked down at her son, who was still asleep, his small face peaceful and unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond the veil of the living world. Her heart ached with love and fear. How could she protect him from something so powerful, so relentless? The wind howled outside, and Mrs. Thompson knew that the spirit would be back. It would stop at nothing to reclaim what it believed was rightfully hers. And next time, it might not leave empty-handed. Part 8. A terrifying encounter. The storm outside howled like a ravenous beast, its furious wind slashing against the walls of the Thompson home. The rain pounded against the windows with such ferocity that it seemed like the glass would shatter at any moment. Lightning flashed, illuminating the darkened sky with brief bursts of violent energy, followed by the deep rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Inside, the tension was palpable. Mrs. Thompson sat on the edge of the couch, wringing her hands nervously, her gaze darting toward the hallway that led to John's room. The oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the house for weeks had reached a fever pitch tonight. She could feel it, an undercurrent of malevolent energy that seemed to pulse with every gust of wind outside. Beside her, Mr. Thompson paced the floor, his face etched with worry. "Something's wrong," he muttered, more to himself than to his wife. His eyes kept flicking to the windows, as if expecting to see someone outside, lurking just beyond the safety of the glass. I can feel it in my bones." Mrs. Thompson nodded wordlessly. She had felt the shift too, but she didn't have the words to describe it. It was a pressure, an invisible weight that had been growing heavier with each passing day. And tonight it felt like that weight was about to come crashing down on them. The lights flickered. Both of them froze, their eyes widening as the soft glow of the lamps dimmed and brightened sporadically, as if struggling to stay lit. The wind outside screamed, louder now, more insistent. The storm had become a monstrous force, relentless in its fury. A sudden crash echoed from the hallway, the sound of something heavy falling to the floor. Mrs. Thompson gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. "John," she cried, rushing toward the sound. Mr. Thompson was right behind her, his footsteps heavy as they thundered down the hall. They burst into John's room, but what they saw stopped them cold. John stood in the middle of the room, his small figure bathed in the eerie light of the flickering lamps. His back was to them, his head bowed slightly, and his arms hung limply at his sides. But it wasn't the sight of their son that sent a chill down their spines, it was what stood behind him. A figure. The spirit of John's mother had fully manifested, and her presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. She hovered above the ground, her long, tattered dress swaying, as if caught in a non-existent breeze. Her hair, wild and matted, framed a face that was both gaunt and pale, her hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Her mouth was twisted into a cruel sneer, and her skeletal fingers reached out toward John, as though preparing to claim him for her own. The air in the room was thick with an unnatural cold, colder than any winter night. Mrs. Thompson felt the chill seep into her bones, freezing her in place. Her breath came out in shallow, panicked gasps as she tried to comprehend the horror unfolding before her. The spirit's voice, when it came, was a low, guttural whisper that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. "He's mine," she hissed, her words dripping with malice. "He was always mine." John turned slowly to face his parents, and what they saw in his eyes made their blood run cold. It wasn't their John anymore. His eyes were distant, glazed over with an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow the light around him. His expression was blank, devoid of the warmth and love that had always radiated from him. He stood there, eerily still, as if he were no longer in control of his own body. "He's coming with me," the spirit continued, her voice rising in pitch, growing more venomous with every word. "He belongs in the world of the dead with me." No, Mrs. Thompson's voice broke as she lunged forward, but Mr. Thompson grabbed her arm, pulling her back. She struggled against him, tears streaming down her face. "He's our son. You can't take him." The spirit's eyes flicked toward her, and the room seemed to grow even colder, the air so thick with malice that it became difficult to breathe. "You took him from me," the spirit spat, her voice trembling with rage. "And now I will take him back." The lights flickered again, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The wind outside howled even louder, and with it came a low, mournful wail, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere else. It was a sound filled with sorrow, with fury, with the anguish of a mother who had been wronged. Mrs. Thompson's heart raced as she fumbled in the darkness, trying to find her son. "John," she cried, her voice shaking with terror. "John, please," but John didn't respond. Suddenly, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the room for a brief moment, and in that moment Mrs. Thompson saw her son. He was standing in the center of the room, but he wasn't alone. The spirit of his mother loomed behind him, her arms outstretched, her bony fingers brushing against John's shoulders. And John ... John was moving toward her, as if drawn by some invisible force. "No," Mrs. Thompson screamed, her voice raw with desperation. She lunged forward again, but her hands passed through John's body as if he were made of mist. He was slipping away from her, disappearing into the darkness, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Mr. Thompson grabbed her, pulling her back once more. "We can't fight her," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She's too powerful. We can't let her take him," Mrs. Thompson sobbed, her body shaking with fear and grief. "He's our son. We can't lose him. Another flash of lightning lit up the room, and this time they saw John standing at the foot of the bed, his body still and rigid, his face expressionless. His eyes, though open, were empty like those of a doll. The spirit hovered above him, her face twisted with a sickening mixture of triumph and malice. "He will come with me," the spirit intoned, her voice a low growl that reverberated through the walls. "He belongs to the dead now." "No," Mrs. Thompson cried, her voice breaking. "Please, no." The wind inside the house reached a deafening roar, and the very walls seemed to tremble under the weight of the spirit's power. The lights flickered back on for a brief second, revealing John standing directly beneath the spirit, her arms wrapped around him as if pulling him into the other world. Mrs. Thompson's breath hitched as she saw her son so close, yet so far out of reach. In that moment she knew they were losing him, slipping further and further away into the cold grip of death. "Let him go," Mr. Thompson shouted, stepping forward, though his voice trembled with fear. The spirit turned toward him, her hollow eyes burning with an intensity that made the room seem to grow smaller, the walls pressing in on all sides. She smiled a cruel, menacing grin, and with one final gust of icy wind, she began to pull John toward the window, as if the very storm outside had come to claim him. But in that final moment, something in John shifted. His eyes flickered, and for a brief second, the darkness within them seemed to falter. He turned his head toward his parents, a single tear slipping down his pale cheek. "Mom ... Mimi says." Thompson's heart shattered at the sound of her son's voice, and without thinking she rushed forward, breaking free of her husband's grip. She reached out, her hands grasping desperately for John's arm. "John," she cried, "I'm here. I won't let her take you," the spirit shrieked, her wail rising in pitch as the room exploded with a violent gust of wind. The lights flickered wildly, the walls shaking as the spirit's fury reached its peak. But Mrs. Thompson held on, her fingers digging into John's arm, refusing to let him go. "John," she screamed, her voice raw with emotion, "fight her. You have to fight her for a moment." It seemed as though John was slipping away completely, his body growing colder, his movements sluggish. But then, with a surge of willpower, he reached up and grabbed his mother's hand, his grip weak but determined. The spirit howled, her form flickering and distorting as if the very fabric of her existence was being torn apart. "No," she screamed, her voice filled with rage and despair. "He is mine. He belongs to me." But John held on. The lights flickered once more, then steadied, casting a warm glow over the room. The wind died down, the storm outside seeming to lose its power. The spirit's form wavered, her body growing translucent, her eyes wide with fury and desperation. With one final, anguished wail, the spirit of John's mother vanished, her form dissipating into thin air, leaving behind only the lingering cold and the sound of the storm outside. John collapsing to his mother's arms, his body trembling, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Mrs. Thompson held him tightly, her heart pounding in her chest, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay, John," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're safe now. You're safe." But even as she spoke those words, a deep sense of unease settled in her chest. The spirit was gone for now, but Mrs. Thompson knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Part 9. The Final Vanishing. The wind had stilled, but the silence that followed felt far more sinister than the howling storm. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. The Thompson home, once a place of warmth and comfort, now seemed like a tomb, cold, empty, and suffocating. Mrs. Thompson cradled John in her arms, her fingers brushing through his hair, trying to comfort him, to keep him tethered to the world of the living. But deep down in the pit of her soul she knew. The chilling truth gnawed at her, despite her efforts to deny it. John wasn't theirs, he had never truly belonged to them, and now the darkness had come to claim him. John's small body was trembling, his breath coming in shallow gasps, as though the weight of the spectral world was pulling him under. His eyes, half-lidded and glassy, flickered between the boy they had known and something unearthly, something not of this world. There was a distant look in his gaze, as though he were already stepping into the realm of shadows, his soul slowly slipping beyond the veil. Mrs. Thompson sobbed softly, her tears staining his hair, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Stay with me, John. Please, baby, don't leave us. Don't go." John blinked slowly, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. He seemed to be struggling caught between two worlds, as if the living part of him was trying to fight back, to remain with the parents who had loved him. But then his hand, which had been clutching his mother's arm, began to loosen, his grip weakening, fingers sliding from hers. "John, no," Mrs. Thompson cried, tightening her hold on him, but even as she did, she felt his weight growing lighter, as though he were fading. From the corner of the room the air began to stir once more. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but then it grew colder, darker, the familiar oppressive presence filling the space once again. The icy chill that accompanied John's mother returned, curling around them like a deathly embrace. A figure began to materialize in the darkness, faint at first like a trick of the light, but quickly growing more solid, more defined. The ghostly figure of John's mother stood at the foot of the bed, hollow eyes locked on her child. Her face was twisted into a grotesque mask of longing and rage. The once human features had become contorted with years of torment and unfulfilled desires. Her lips curled into a cruel smile, her bony fingers reaching out toward John with terrifying intent. "He is mine," she whispered, her voice like the wind from the grave, low and guttural. "He has always been mine." No, Mr. Thompson's voice cracked as he rushed forward, grabbing hold of John's other arm, pulling desperately, trying to keep him grounded, to keep him with them. "We can't take him. He's our son." The spirit's eyes flickered toward Mr. Thompson, her smile fading into something darker, more malevolent. "He was never yours," she hissed, her voice resonating with an unnatural echo. "He was given to me the moment he drew his first breath. You have kept him from me for too long." As her words fell like lead into the room, John's body began to shimmer faintly, his form flickering as if he were caught between dimensions. His skin grew paler, his breath fainter, and his eyes, once filled with the innocent curiosity of a child, seemed clouded with the knowledge of something far more ancient, something far more sinister. "Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled as she held on to him with everything she had, her heart breaking as she realized that no matter how tightly she held him, she couldn't stop what was happening. She couldn't save him. "Please," she whispered through her tears, her voice barely audible. "Please don't take him from us." John's ghostly mother tilted her head, her expression softening for just a moment, but it was not a look of sympathy. It was one of finality, a cold realization that nothing could stop what was already in motion. "It is time," the spirit murmured, her bony fingers curling once more, beckoning John to her. "Come, my son, come where you belong." A gust of wind blasted through the room, though the windows remained tightly shut. The air itself seemed to howl, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. John's body jerked in his parents' arms, and with a strangled gasp, he rose to his feet, his movements slow, deliberate, but unnaturally smooth, his head tilted slightly as he turned toward the specter of his mother, his face emotionless, his eyes glassy and vacant. Mrs. Thompson screamed, her heart shattering into a million pieces as she tried to pull him back, but her hands grasped only air. John moved through her, his body now ethereal, no longer bound to the physical world. "John, no, please. Don't leave us." Her voice was a mix of desperation and agony, but it was too late. Her hands passed through his ghostly form as though he were nothing more than mist. The ghostly figure of John's mother reached out and touched John's cheek, her touch cold and devoid of life. "Come," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of an eternal sorrow. "It's time to go home." John's lips parted, his eyes meeting his mother's for what felt like the last time. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely a breath, a distant echo that seemed to come from somewhere far away. "I have to go." And with that, John turned and walked toward the darkness, toward the waiting arms of his ghostly mother. Mrs. Thompson tried to scream, tried to reach for him, but her voice died in her throat. All she could do was watch in helpless horror as her son, her precious boy, vanished into the shadows, swallowed whole by the darkness. The room fell deathly silent. The wind stopped, the air stilled, and the oppressive cold that had permeated the house was gone. But the emptiness that remained was far worse. Mr. Thompson fell to his knees, staring at the spot where John had disappeared, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He's ... She's gone, he whispered, his voice hollow, disbelieving. He's really gone. Mrs. Thompson collapsed beside him, her body racked with sobs, her heart breaking in a way that could never be mended. We lost him, she wept, burying her face in her hands. We lost him. But as they sat there, their world shattered around them, the horrible truth began to sink in. John had never truly belonged to them. From the moment they had found him in that graveyard, from the very first breath he had taken, he had been claimed by forces far beyond their understanding, far beyond their control. They had fought so hard to keep him, to raise him, to love him, but in the end it hadn't mattered. He had always belonged to the dead. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now stood silent and cold like a mausoleum. The Thompson family had been reduced to two grieving parents, haunted by the knowledge that they had loved something that had never truly been theirs. And somewhere in the deep, endless darkness, John and his mother walked together, reunited in the place where the living dared not go. A final gust of wind rattled the windows, as if the world itself was bidding them farewell. And then ... nothing, just the unbearable quiet of a home that had lost its heart. John was gone, and he would never come back.